You lost, kid. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom, dry and condescending. All eyes turned toward the young black man standing alone in a sleek gray suit, no older than 19. But Jalen Carter didn't flinch. "No, Your Honor," he said calmly, holding a worn leather briefcase. "I'm here to represent the defendant, Marcus Carter. My father." The courtroom fell silent. A few chuckles slipped through the benches. Even the prosecutor smirked. Judge Whitmore leaned forward, squinting as if Jalen had spoken in another language. "You're representing your father?" Whitmore scoffed. "This is a court of law, not a high school debate team." "I understand, Your Honor." My father waived his right to counsel. "I've filed a motion under pro se representation." The judge flipped through the file. His eyebrows rose slightly. Jalen wasn't bluffing. The paperwork was in order. "For the record," the judge muttered, "this court strongly advises against self-representation, especially from children playing dress-up." Laughter broke out. A few spectators shook their heads. A reporter in the back pressed record, sensing something worth capturing. But Jalen stood tall, steady. "With respect, Your Honor," he said, "I've studied this case carefully. My father didn't steal anything. He was profiled, arrested without evidence, and I can prove it." The judge rolled his eyes. "We'll see how long your confidence holds. Proceed." Jalen walked to the defense table, opened his briefcase, and spread out his files. His hands moved with precision. Papers labeled, timestamps noted, arguments highlighted. He didn't look like a teenager pretending. He looked like someone ready for battle. Across the aisle, the prosecutor, Ms. Granger, leaned over to the bailiff. "This'll be quick," she whispered. "He's going to crash and burn." The bailiff didn't answer. He was too busy watching Jalen lock in. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jalen began, addressing the jury, "you're going to hear that my father stole a power drill from a hardware store. But what you won't hear from the prosecution is this. There's no footage of the theft, no fingerprints, and no eyewitness that matches his description. In fact, the only thing they do have is an assumption." The courtroom quieted. The chuckles stopped. "My father," Jalen continued, voice steady, "was arrested because he looked like someone they'd seen before. That's not justice. That's profiling. And by the time this trial ends, you'll see just how broken the system really is." Judge Whitmore narrowed his eyes. This wasn't going the way he thought. Behind him, the reporter leaned in, still recording. Something was happening here. This wasn't a joke. This was a fight. And the kid? He came to win. "Let's make this quick," Ms. Granger said with a smug smile, "so the boy can go home and finish his homework." A few jurors chuckled. Judge Whitmore didn't stop them. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, arms folded, eyes fixed on Jalen like he was watching a school play. But Jalen didn't blink. "I'd be happy to get this over with," he replied calmly, "once the truth comes out." The courtroom stirred. This kid had nerve. Granger rose, heels clicking across the floor. "The prosecution calls Officer Dale Henson to the stand." The bailiff opened the door. A stocky white officer in his 40s stepped in, chest puffed. He sat and was sworn in. Granger wasted no time. "Officer Henson, can you walk us through the day you arrested Mr. Marcus Carter?" "Yes, ma'am," Henson said. "We got a call from a store clerk about a suspected shoplifting. I arrived on scene and the clerk pointed out Mr. Carter exiting the store. He matched the description, black male, gray hoodie, jeans. I stopped him and found a power drill in his bag. He had no receipt." She turned to the jury. "And what did he say when you questioned him?" "He denied everything. Said he bought it but couldn't prove it." "Thank you. No further questions." She sat oozing confidence. Judge Whitmore nodded at Jalen. "Your witness. Try not to waste our time." Jalen stood. He didn't look nervous, he looked ready. "Officer Henson," he began, "you said the clerk pointed my father out. Did he mention anything about skin color?" Henson shifted. "Well, yeah. Said it was a black male. Any facial details? Hair? Age? No. Just said black male, gray hoodie." Jalen nodded. "Did you check the security cameras before making the arrest?" "No. We don't always do that right away." "You arrested him before verifying the footage?" "That's standard when there's a complaint and a suspect present." Jalen turned to the jury. So my father was arrested based on a vague description and possession of an item he had no receipt for. Is that correct? Correct. Jalen walked to his briefcase, pulled out a printed receipt, and held it up. This receipt, he said, was found crumpled at the bottom of the shopping bag by store security after the arrest. It's time-stamped 5 minutes before Officer Henson arrived. Same drill, same store. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Judge Whitmore sat up straighter. Granger's eyes narrowed. Jalen walked back to the witness stand. One more question, Officer Henson. Did you find any security footage of the theft? Henson hesitated. No. So there's no proof my father stole anything? No. No further questions. Jalen sat down. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. Ms. Granger stood, forcing a smile. Objection, Your Honor. That receipt hasn't been authenticated. Then authenticate it, Jalen said. I subpoenaed the store manager. He's waiting outside. Judge Whitmore looked stunned. You did what? I filed the paperwork last week. Clerk signed off on it. The judge glanced at the court clerk, who nodded awkwardly. Whitmore adjusted his robe, visibly annoyed. Fine. Bring him in. The manager entered and confirmed everything. The receipt was real, the drill was purchased, and the camera footage never showed Marcus stealing anything. Granger sat down slowly, her face flushed. Jalen looked over at the jury. Some of them smiled. Judge Whitmore tapped his gavel. Court will recess for 15 minutes. He stood up quickly and walked out, without making eye contact with Jalen. Behind him, the courtroom buzzed with something new. Respect. The courtroom doors hadn't even closed behind Judge Whitmore before whispers erupted. Who is this kid? Someone murmured. I thought he was just playing lawyer, said another. Jalen sat alone at the defense table, flipping through his notes with laser focus. Across from him, Ms. Granger was clearly rattled, scribbling new notes, tapping her pen nervously. 15 minutes later, the judge returned, stone-faced. Court is back in session, he announced. Let's proceed. Granger stood stiffly. The prosecution calls Officer Reynolds. A younger cop with a buzz cut stepped up. Granger leaned heavily on him, trying to recover ground. But his testimony was weak. He admitted he never spoke to the store clerk himself and had only backed up Officer Henson. Jalen didn't even need to cross-examine. No questions, Your Honor. The judge nodded, then looked at Granger. You may call your next witness. She hesitated. The prosecution rests. A wave of surprise moved through the room. All right, said Whitmore. Defense may proceed. Jalen stood. I'd like to recall the store clerk to the stand. Granger's head snapped up. Objection. He already gave a statement. He didn't testify under oath, Jalen interrupted. I have the right to examine him directly. The judge, cornered by the law side. I'll allow it. The store clerk walked in, mid-30s, nervous, clearly uncomfortable. You recognize my father? Jalen asked. The man glanced at Marcus Carter, then looked down. Yes. Did you see him take anything from your store? No. Then why did you accuse him? The clerk swallowed hard. The officer said, if I didn't make a formal complaint, the store might be seen as uncooperative. They said it was routine, that he fit a description. The courtroom exploded. Order. Judge Whitmore barked, slamming the gavel. Order. But the damage was done. Jalen stepped closer to the witness box. So you lied, under pressure? Yes. I panicked. I'm sorry. Jalen took a breath. No further questions. Granger didn't even stand. No questions. The store clerk walked out head down. Jalen turned to the judge. Your Honor, I move to dismiss this case. The charges are built on lies, no evidence, and racial profiling. The judge looked at him, stone still. Then, instead of ruling, he stood up and left the bench. Gasps swept the room. Where's he going? Someone whispered. 10 minutes passed. No one moved. Then the side door opened. Judge Whitmore returned, but he wasn't alone. A tall man in a dark suit followed him in. The man scanned the courtroom, then sat quietly in the front row. Jalen raised an eyebrow. So did Granger. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat. Before I issue a decision, the court will hear a statement from Mr. Cole, a senior investigator from the State Bar Association. Now everyone was alert. Cole stood. This court has been under routine observation due to concerns about discrimination and improper procedure. Today's hearing has provided significant insight. I'll be submitting a full report. The judge's face paled slightly. Jalen, surprised, nodded respectfully. Cole looked directly at him. And as for you, Mr. Carter, I've been watching. You're sharp, prepared, and relentless. You've got instincts most attorneys don't even have. Jalen didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The courtroom was a powder keg and Jalen Carter was holding the match. The weight of the silence in the room was unbearable, like a storm on the horizon. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, his usual composure now slipping. We will resume after a brief recess, he announced, his voice strained. The gavel slammed and the doors to the courtroom slammed shut behind him. Jalen took a deep breath, the pressure building. He had no idea what Cole's appearance meant, but he wasn't going to let it throw him off. The room buzzed as people filed out for the break, but Jalen remained seated, his gaze locked on the jury. The senior investigator from the State Bar had mentioned him directly. For the first time in hours, Jalen allowed himself a small smile. This wasn't just about his father anymore. This was about the system, about everything that had been broken for far too long. And now, for the first time, someone was watching it break wide open. When the judge returned, he didn't sit immediately. Instead, he walked down to the front row where Cole sat, whispered something in his ear, then turned back to the bench. Court will reconvene, Whitmore said flatly, his authority all but gone. He took his seat slowly, eyes flicking between Jalen and Cole. Mr. Cole will be filing his report, but we will proceed with the case. Granger, shaken but composed, stood. The prosecution calls Officer Henson for rebuttal. But Jalen wasn't watching Henson anymore. He was watching the man in the front row, the investigator who had just given his case the credibility it desperately needed. Jalen wasn't just fighting for his father anymore, he was fighting for the truth. Officer Henson stepped to the stand, but his testimony was weak. He stumbled through the questions, clearly off balance after Jalen's revelations. Granger pressed him for more information, trying to salvage something, but Henson was visibly distracted. He didn't even make eye contact with the jury anymore. Jalen took his time with the cross-examination. There was no rush. The cracks were showing. Officer Henson, Jalen said, voice steady, you testified that my father was acting suspiciously, but you never checked the security footage before making the arrest. Correct. Correct. You assumed my father was guilty because of his appearance? Henson shifted uncomfortably. I didn't make that call. It was based on a description. Based on a vague description. No specific details about age, hair, or height. Just black male, gray hoodie. Jalen leaned in, his voice unwavering. So you profiled my father. The room held its breath. Henson's face flushed. No further questions, Jalen said, sitting down with a calm that made everyone else seem on edge. Granger's turn was brief and futile. She tried to twist Jalen's statements, attempted to undermine the store clerk's testimony. But there was no fighting the truth that had already been exposed. When she sat down, defeated, she shot Jalen a glare. The kind that made it clear she knew what was coming next. Jalen didn't waste time. He stood again. Your Honor, the defense rests. The words hit like a declaration. Granger didn't object. She just sat, her head hung low. Jalen glanced at the jury. Their eyes were fixed on him, some of them nodding. The shift in their demeanor was undeniable. They saw what was happening. But the most important person in the room wasn't the jury. It was the judge. Judge Whitmore took a deep breath. His gaze moved to Cole, who was scribbling something in a notebook, his face unreadable. Then the judge turned to the jury, his voice heavy. Members of the jury, he began. You have seen the evidence, heard the testimony. The court will deliberate, and a verdict will be delivered shortly. He stood up and left the bench without looking at anyone. The room stayed quiet. The tension was unbearable. Jalen sat, his jaw clenched, eyes focused on the empty space in front of him. He could feel the weight of the moment. His father's freedom was on the line, but more than that, the truth was now undeniable. When the doors to the jury room finally closed behind the panel, Jalen allowed himself to breathe. Do you really think they'll come back with a verdict today? A voice asked. Jalen looked up. It was Cole. Doesn't matter, Jalen said. I've already won. Cole's lips curled into a slight smile. I've seen a lot of lawyers. You're something else, kid. Jalen didn't smile back. His mind was already moving forward. This wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. The jury deliberated for hours. Jalen sat quietly in his seat, fingers drumming against the table. His father, Marcus, sat beside him, his face drawn, anxious but hopeful. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every minute felt like a lifetime. Outside the courtroom, people gathered, whispers filling the air. The case had become bigger than just Marcus Carter. It was about something much more significant: justice, racial profiling, the power of truth. The small courthouse, usually overlooked, had become ground zero for a battle that would resonate far beyond these walls. And Jalen knew that. He knew his father's case was more than just a trial, it was a moment that could spark change. But what weighed on him most wasn't the case itself. It was the unknown. Would they see the truth? Would the jury listen? Finally, the doors to the jury room opened. The foreperson stood, holding the piece of paper that would decide it all. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Whitmore asked, his voice far less confident than it had been when the trial began. We have, Your Honor, the foreperson replied. The room fell silent. Every eye was locked on the foreperson, waiting. Judge Whitmore motioned for the verdict to be read. The foreperson cleared their throat, looking down at the paper. We, the jury, find the defendant, Marcus Carter, not guilty of all charges. The courtroom erupted. Jalen sat frozen for a moment, his mind struggling to process the words. Not guilty. Marcus stood up, his face a mixture of disbelief and relief. He pulled Jalen into a tight embrace, his voice barely a whisper. We did it. But Jalen barely heard him. His eyes were locked on Judge Whitmore, who had yet to move. For a long moment, the judge stood at the bench, staring straight ahead. Then, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he addressed the courtroom. I would like to address the court, he said, his voice quieter than anyone had ever heard it before. Everyone fell silent again. I've been a judge for over 20 years, Whitmore continued. And in all that time, I've never seen a case quite like this. Not just because of the evidence, though the evidence was compelling, but because of the way one young man, one teenager, has shown me what it means to seek the truth even when it's not convenient. A murmur went through the crowd. Jalen's heart skipped. He wasn't sure what the judge was getting at, but something in his voice suggested this wasn't going to be another reprimand. The judge sighed, clearly conflicted. I've made my share of mistakes. I've overlooked things. I've been too quick to judge. Jalen's chest tightened. This wasn't the moment he expected. In this case, Whitmore paused, clearly fighting his emotions. This case has changed me. The room held its breath. The judge turned to Jalen, his voice soft but firm. You've proven more than just your father's innocence today. You've proven what it means to fight for justice even when it feels impossible. Jalen didn't know how to respond. For the first time in the entire trial, his nerves started to settle. He wasn't just fighting for his father anymore. He was fighting for something bigger. And for that, Whitmore added, his tone now solemn, I will make sure this court undergoes the review it deserves. Jalen's heart skipped again. The words from the judge hung in the air as people began to file out of the courtroom. But it wasn't over. It couldn't be. Jalen stood with his father, a weight lifted from his shoulders but replaced by an entirely new one. He had done it, he had won, but this was just the beginning. He had changed the trajectory of an entire system. As they walked out of the courtroom, reporters swarmed them. Jalen, how did you do it? One asked. Do you think this case will inspire more people to challenge the system? Another shouted. But Jalen didn't have an answer. Not yet. All he could do was look up at his father, still processing everything. His father's voice broke through the noise. You're something else, kid. You just changed everything. Jalen smiled, though it wasn't the same smile he'd worn when the jury announced the verdict. It was a quiet smile, a smile of understanding. This wasn't the end of his fight. It was only the beginning. The days after the trial felt like a blur. Jalen had become a hero in the eyes of the public, his name plastered across headlines. People called him a miracle worker, a young lawyer with the soul of a fighter. He hadn't even finished high school yet, and yet he'd managed to take on the system and win. But there was something he couldn't shake. Something nagging at the back of his mind. Despite everything, the headlines, the interviews, the praise, Jalen couldn't forget the look on Judge Whitmore's face when he'd addressed the courtroom. The judge's words had struck him harder than any verdict ever could. I've made my share of mistakes, Whitmore had said. The words echoed in Jalen's ears. The truth was, Jalen wasn't just fighting for his father. He was fighting for the system, for every wronged person, for every unjust conviction. But Whitmore's statement left him questioning, had he truly won? He couldn't help but wonder about the bigger picture. It was late one night when the call came. Jalen had just finished his homework and was heading to bed when his phone buzzed. "Jalen Carter?" a deep voice asked on the other end. "Yeah, this is Jalen," he replied, a little confused. "This is Investigator Cole. I wanted to let you know something about Judge Whitmore." Jalen sat up straight, the hairs on the back of his neck standing. "What about him?" "There's something you need to know," Cole continued. "We've been reviewing past cases. And Whitmore, he's been involved in some very questionable rulings. Some of them, including cases similar to your father's, have been deliberately mishandled." Jalen's heart skipped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that this man's actions go beyond just poor decisions. There's evidence of corruption, of deliberate injustice." Jalen was silent for a moment, processing the weight of Cole's words. His mind was spinning. Could this be true? Was everything he had fought for part of a much larger system of corruption? "I thought Whitmore was a man of integrity," Jalen finally managed to say. "I thought he was just a judge doing his job." "I know you did," Cole replied. "But sometimes the truth is more complicated than we want to admit." Jalen's mind raced as he clutched the phone tighter. "So what now? What do we do with this information? You've already done the hard part. You've exposed the truth in your case. Now it's time to make sure others don't fall through the cracks like your father did." The call ended abruptly and Jalen sat there in stunned silence. The next morning, Jalen made a decision. He wasn't just going to let this lie in the shadows. The system was still broken, and now it was his responsibility to fix it. He knew that exposing Whitmore's corruption wouldn't be easy, but the truth had to come out no matter the cost. As he stood at his front door, about to head out to meet Cole, Marcus walked into the room. "Son," he said quietly, his voice full of pride. "I'm proud of you. You've done more than I ever could have imagined. But whatever you do next, don't forget why you started this. Don't let the fight take away everything you've worked for." Jalen nodded, looking at his father with a steady resolve. "I won't forget. But this fight isn't over. Not by a long shot." Jalen didn't sleep that night. His mind kept racing with what Cole had said. Corruption. Deliberate injustice. How far did it go? Who else was involved? And most importantly, could he really take down someone like Judge Whitmore, a man who had been in power for decades? The morning light did nothing to ease his nerves. He sat at the kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, staring into the emptiness of the room. Marcus, his father, had already left for work. But Jalen knew the weight of this decision was going to fall on him and him alone. By noon, he was sitting in Cole's office, facing a pile of files stacked high on the table. Cole's office was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old paper. Jalen could feel the gravity of the moment pressing on his chest. "So, what do we do now?" Jalen asked, his voice quiet but filled with determination. Cole leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "We gather evidence. We need a paper trail. You'll need to testify. But we can't do this without your help. The stakes are high, Jalen. If we go public with this, it's going to get ugly." Jalen nodded, his jaw tight. He had already come this far, already exposed the lies about his father's case. He couldn't back down now. "I'm in," he said, the words coming out sharper than he'd intended. He wasn't just doing this for his father anymore, this was about something much bigger. "I'll do whatever it takes to bring the truth to light." Cole gave him a grim smile. "I knew you would. You're a fighter." For the next several days, Jalen worked tirelessly. He combed through case files, interviewed witnesses, and pieced together the puzzle that was Judge Whitmore's corruption. He learned that the judge had been involved in several shady rulings, all connected to racially charged cases where black defendants were unfairly sentenced. But the most shocking discovery came when Jalen found a hidden ledger that connected Whitmore to a series of illegal kickbacks from private prison companies. The evidence was damning. By the time Jalen was ready to confront Whitmore, he was more confident than he'd ever been. He had all the ammunition he needed, proof that would expose Whitmore for the fraud he truly was. Jalen called a press conference. The room was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as Jalen took the stage, his father standing beside him. Jalen's heart was pounding in his chest, but he didn't let it show. "Thank you all for coming," Jalen began, his voice steady but full of authority. "Today, I'm here to talk about justice, about the truth that has been hidden for too long, and most importantly, about a system that has failed too many people like my father." He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. "What I'm about to reveal will shock you. It's not just about my father's case. It's about the corruption that runs deep in our justice system. I've uncovered evidence that Judge Whitmore, who ruled in my father's case, has been involved in a series of illegal activities. His rulings have been influenced by financial kickbacks from private prison companies, and his decisions have been designed to maintain a broken system of mass incarceration. Gasps filled the room as reporters scrambled to take notes. Jalen could feel the weight of every eye on him, but he didn't falter. He kept going. "I have proof," he said, holding up the ledger, the key piece of evidence. "This is the proof that Judge Whitmore has been accepting bribes in exchange for sentencing decisions. He has taken part in a system that profits from the destruction of black lives." There was a brief silence and then a rush of questions. The reporters fired off one after another, demanding details, wanting confirmation. But Jalen was ready for them. He answered every question with precision, no hesitation in his voice. And then, as the questions slowed, he added one final statement. "Today, I'm calling for a full investigation into Judge Whitmore and his involvement in this corrupt system. It's time for real change, for accountability. We cannot allow this to continue any longer." The room was in chaos. The air was thick with disbelief and excitement. But Jalen stood there, calm and collected, knowing that this was just the beginning of a much larger fight. As the press conference ended, Jalen walked outside to find a swarm of reporters waiting for him, but his mind was elsewhere. He had exposed the truth. He had shown the world the corruption that had been hiding in plain sight. But what would happen next? Would the system retaliate? Could he really bring Whitmore down? The next few weeks were a blur of news stories, investigations, and public outcry. Whitmore's name was dragged through the mud. His past rulings were called into question, and his connections to private prisons were put under the microscope. It wasn't long before the judge was suspended and a full inquiry was launched into his activities. But even as the world started to take notice, Jalen couldn't help but think about what he had started. This wasn't just about one corrupt judge. It was about the system itself. And Jalen knew, deep down, that his fight wasn't over. What do you think about the corruption in the justice system? Have you ever witnessed an injustice that went unnoticed? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.